Do you want to kick some serious butt in business? I'm going to show you exactly how to execute your strategy. And in case you've missed my last video where I walked you through how to design your strategy, you can check that out. Links down below in the description. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I want to get into execution, but I want to give you a high-level overview just as a refresher. At the very top of my strategy framework, I have the strategic problem. Right? Remember, I had to learn this on my own. Nobody taught me strategy. I spent thousands and thousands of hours doing this, implementing it in businesses. I know this works. So here's the framework that I follow. The strategic problem, this is the number one constraint in your business. This is the obstacle that's holding you back from achieving the results that you want. You have to get really clear on that, and it starts with defining your strategic problem. At the very center of your strategy, you have your ICP. That's your ideal customer profile. This is the one avatar that you're setting out to serve, okay? Then we have 4 quadrants surrounding the ICP, starting with shared aspiration. And this is where you define what does winning look like for your company, for your customers, for your employees, for your vendors, for your investors, all the stakeholders in your business. Then you move over here to market, focus, and position. And this is where you're going to get really clear on where your company is going to compete. It's going to include the geographies, the industries, your product and service, your stage of production, everything related to your go-to-market strategy. So you define that, and then you move down here to competitive behavior. And you're going to decide which generic strategy you're going to pursue. Cost leadership, differentiation, or focus. Those are the 3 generic strategies according to Michael Porter. And there's some other things that you're going to figure out in this phase. Once again, watch that other video. I go into much more detail. And then finally, in this last box, we have resources and returns. This is where you'll decide what resources do you need to execute your strategy and what types of returns you can expect, specifically your return on invested capital and the cash flow based on this strategic option. This is the framework. So imagine you have this for your business. You're feeling pretty good, right? Because there's a lot more clarity. You're like, okay, I know my problem. I know what winning looks like. I have a go-to-market strategy. We know our competitive behavior, the activities we're going to pursue. We know our model. We know our offer. We know everything in order to fulfill our products and services. And then you're also really clear on what resources you need, what types of returns you're going to generate. And you're like, yes, this is where a lot of people get excited. But then that quickly fades and goes downhill because they don't have a system to execute. That's what I'm going to give to you. This is exactly how I turn around and scale businesses. And you could do the exact same thing in your company. You could literally just copy this framework. So let's get into the execution framework. I call this IARs. And I'm going to give you the backstory here. So I actually wrote about this years ago in my second book called Outsizing. I go into all the details, but nonetheless, I'll spare you the book and I'll cut to the chase. I was serving for a board of directors and we had this facilitator come in and he was well-intentioned, all right? He's just a little misinformed, but he ultimately created this strategy for our organization, the organization I was serving with. And he comes up with this framework, this whole strategy. And he's like, okay, so we have our goals, we have our objectives, we have our initiatives, we have our actions, we have our tasks. And he broke down the whole strategy like this. And he's like, all right, this is how you're going to go out there and execute. And I remember sitting in this meeting and I raised my hand and I was like, I really like this. I think that's a solid objective. And he goes, Steve, that's not an objective. That's an initiative. An initiative, Steve. And I was like, okay, sorry. What I was meaning is I really like this initiative because I think it gives us a lot of clarity on how we're going to execute our actions. And he's like, Steve, those aren't actions. Those are tasks. And I was like, what the heck? Okay, this is like way too complicated. And the same thing is true out there in the world today. You have objectives, key results, you have rocks, you have initiatives, you have all this stuff, right? You have priorities. So let's just keep it really simple. If you look at the definition of a goal, so if you just say, okay, I have a goal with my strategy. Well, a goal can be broken down into 3 component parts. First, you need to have an aim. That's your initiative, right? That's your 3 to 5 year high level direction of your business, maybe shorter, maybe a shorter time frame. But typically it's this direction that you want to take the company in from a macro level. Then you say, okay, well, that's great to have this macro level aim, but you need to define the baby steps, all the actions you're going to take in order to execute that goal. And then finally, you need to measure by defining your key results, your results. And that's where I just took goal and I disaggregated it into 3 parts, and I came up with the IAR framework. Now, it doesn't matter if you go initiatives, results, and actions. I don't care. I just didn't want to call my framework IRAs. I mean, you can imagine that. I'm a financial guy. I go into a company and I say, you need an IRA. And they're like, what? We already have an IRA. We have a 401k actually. You're like, okay, never mind. A little confusing. Okay, so it's IARs. So let's check this out. Let's see how we can actually execute this. In your company, you have a strategic problem, right? That's the last framework that I showed you here. And you're going to start with your strategic problem because really you want to be clear on what is the number one constraint in your business, and you want to figure out how to solve that. Now, let's just say for this company, the strategic problem is revenue is declining and customers are churning at a very fast pace. Therefore, the company's cash flow is also going down. And if they don't solve this, then they're going to go bankrupt. Can't even spell there. That is bankrupt there. So you'll notice here with the strategic problem statement, you have the problem, revenue's dropping, customers are churning, and cash flow is decreasing. All these are related. Now, you don't want to just list the problem. You want to say, this is what's happening, and if we don't do anything about it, what is the outcome? What is the consequence? That's the consequence. That makes a really clear strategic problem statement. Here's our problem. If we don't act, we're going to go bankrupt. All right, that can be scary for some leaders, and sometimes they want to sugarcoat it. Don't sugarcoat it. Be crystal clear, be very specific with your team, and just cut to the chase. Okay, great. This is the problem we're trying to solve. Now, let's whip out the IARs, starting with initiatives. Initiatives do 4 things. First, they help you to overcome the strategic problem. So you're only going to pursue initiatives that are going to ultimately help solve this problem, right? That's why I talked about in my other video the importance of getting the strategic problem right. Because imagine if you don't, you're just going to be coming up with a bunch of random things that you're doing, and it's not solving the core problem, and then your business goes bankrupt. Imagine this company, in other words, they're struggling with revenue and customer retention, and they get together, they have the strategy offsite, and they're like, you know what, we need to build a stronger culture. Now look, I'm not poo-pooing culture. Culture could be good. But if you don't solve this problem, right, your business is going to go bankrupt. You're going down. You could go down with a great culture. But if you don't solve this, nothing else matters, right? So you have the strategic problem defined, and that's what the initiative is going to do. It's going to help you to overcome the strategic problem. The next thing, it's going to enhance the customer experience. Because you want to invest in things, you want to pursue things that are going to deliver an exceptional and a unique experience to your customers. That's the key. That's why we have the ICP, the ideal customer profile, in the middle of the framework. Okay, the next thing that initiative does is it helps you to foster innovation. Look, the world's moving so fast. There's so much disruption out there. If you're not investing in innovation, not innovation just for innovation's sake, but if your company is not streamlining processes, automating, adopting AI, getting more lean, serving the customer better, coming up with products and services that are new and cutting edge, you're going to ultimately fail. So fostering innovation is a really critical piece of initiatives. And then the last piece is competitive advantage. So initiatives should help you to create a competitive advantage. Now look, your initiative doesn't have to do all 4 things. If it touches on all 4 things, that's amazing. That means you have a really strong initiative. But if it doesn't touch on any of these, you have a wrong initiative. This is a great 4-point check to ensure that you're pursuing the right things. It's all about focus when it comes to strategy. All right. Now, when it comes to competitive advantage, this is a side tangent, but it's going to be super helpful. When I work with companies, I just define competitive advantage really simply because I don't like things to be overly complex. When it comes to competitive advantage, you can determine whether you have one or not very quickly. Go to your profit and loss statement. Here's your P&L. And go to the very bottom to your operating income or your operating profit or your net income, whatever you want to look at. But look at your bottom line and look at this number right here. And let's just say it's 7% for your business. But the industry average, when you benchmark your company, let's just say it's 10%. It can vary by industry, so be sure to get the specifics for your company. But when you do this exercise, let's say you're earning a 7% profit, but the industry average is 10%, guess what? You don't have a competitive advantage because the sheer definition of a competitive advantage is that you can earn above industry average profits. So that's just a quick way to determine whether or not you have one because a lot of people go around, they're like, oh yeah, we have all these competitive advantages. And it's like, no, you don't, because look at your P&L. That's why I love finance. That's why I love finance and strategy, especially together, because it tells the full story. So I think we're good with initiatives. I gave you the 4-point checklist. Now let me give you an example. So following the same strategic problem that we have up above, if revenue's dropping, customers are churning, and cash flow is the result, like poor cash flow is the result, and the company is facing bankruptcy, let's just say that the company identified the number one reason why customers are churning is that the customer experience is terrible. Perhaps the initiative would be defined as they want to surprise and delight customers. See how broad and generic that initiative is? It's really simple. It's not super long. It's not multiple sentences. It's not a paragraph. It's just a short little phrase that people can remember. And we're going to get into the specificity, how to actually do this in the actions. But for now, the general direction is the company wants to double down on and invest in surprising and delighting their customers. Okay. Does this help to solve the strategic problem if they do this really well? Yes, check. Does it enhance the customer experience? Yeah, I mean, they're improving the customer experience in itself. Does it foster innovation? Yes, because probably along the way of surprising and delighting their customers, they're going to come up with new cutting edge things. And then finally, with competitive advantage, will this help them to differentiate? Absolutely. Think about in the world of hospitality. Lately, it's been going downhill, right? Going down the toilet. So this will help the company really differentiate themselves. Now, like I said, it doesn't have to check all these 4 boxes, but in this case, it does. Great. All right, let's move on to actions. This is where you're going to get really specific on the things you're going to do in order to execute this. Let me give you a few examples and I'm going to walk you through a 3-part test to determine whether your action is solid. So let's just say the company's brainstorming like, okay, what can we do to surprise and delight our customers? And like, okay, number 1, we need to improve our onboarding process because maybe onboarding is terrible, all right? Maybe they need to have cleaner stores. Maybe they need to have a better website. Maybe somebody throws out creating a new logo, doing a brand identity guide, right? Maybe the other thing is they need to have a better referral program. And maybe they need to have better tools and resources. And the last one I'll throw in there, they need to hire a customer success manager. All right, so these are all the actions that the company brainstormed. So the 3-part tool that I want to give you here is just spelled out as ICE, I-C-E. And this connects back to your actions. So first is impact, second is confidence, and third is ease of execution. So when looking at all these different actions, it's so easy to come up with a list of actions. Companies are really good at creating more work for themselves. What you're going to want to do is first say, okay, onboarding, what's the impact of getting onboarding right? Like, well, if we can improve onboarding, we can probably increase retention by 20%. Whoa, really? That's a huge upside there. Okay, How confident are you that you can put in place a better onboarding process? You may think, I'm very confident, right? I know the tools and resources I can put in place to make that happen. And then ease of execution, how difficult would it be to make the onboarding process better? And you're like, we could do it probably in the next week. So this action checks all the boxes for ICE: impact, confidence, and ease. So onboarding would be a pretty good action to pursue. What about cleaner stores? You do the same exact thing. What's the impact? The confidence that you could actually do it, and then the ease of execution. Then what you'll learn is when you get down the line, there are going to be some actions like the website. You're like, okay, what's the impact? You're like, that probably won't impact much because we're not losing customers because of our website. Even if confidence and ease of execution is high, this may be a terrible action to pursue. Same thing with logo and rebrand. And when you put this in place, this is how you get super focused on the actions. Now, let me speak to business owners and CEOs. So if this is you, check this out. The best business leaders are the ones that can eliminate distractions. Steve Jobs, for example, he was an expert with this, and he got really clear with signal and noise. And basically, noise was everything that was distracting his company from following the signal, right? From creating innovative products and just becoming the Apple that they became. And so the same thing is true in your business. If you're leading the company, great leaders don't add more actions. They actually eliminate actions. They ease the burdens of their employees and they take things off their plate. I had a CEO once I was working with, and he was constantly like, Steve, what are you working on? I was like, A, B, and C. He's like, eliminate A and eliminate C. I'm like, really? Eliminate those? He's like, yeah, just do B. And then let's move fast. Let's move forward. And I was like, okay, great. And I had a lot of respect for that leader because he intuitively followed this exact framework, even though ice wasn't invented at the time. Not the ice you put in your drink, obviously. Okay. Now let's go to the last one is the R. This stands for results. And you can call these KPIs, metrics, measures, whatever you want to do. They're all the same thing, but ultimately you want to measure your progress of your initiatives and your actions to determine whether or not you're actually creating value. So it's really important to take your initiatives and ask, how are we going to measure whether or not we're on track? And the best thing you can do is just to define one key result per initiative. You don't want to have like 5 or you don't want to have 10. It's going to create a lot of complication. But what's the one thing you need to do to measure this? So if I'm looking at surprise and delight, and I'm also looking at my strategic problem, perhaps one of the best measures for this initiative is my churn rate, how fast I'm losing customers. And so I'm going to pay very close attention to this. And let's just say for my business, it's currently at 15%. And I go out there and I execute this initiative to surprise and delight customers. I'm only pursuing actions that meet the ICE criteria. And then I'm measuring things on a regular basis. And let's just say it's 15% now. And then the following month, it jumps to 17%. Well, guess what? My actions are probably off track. Now, keep in mind, there is some lag with your actions. You're going to go out there and execute on some things, and it takes time to correct bad behavior. So just be patient with that, but only be patient up to a point. If this keeps going in the wrong direction, you know you're pursuing the wrong actions. On the other hand, let's just say it's 15%, and you go out there and you improve your onboarding process, and then you measure the following month, and it drops to 10. You're like, wow, that was solid. Okay, now let's do the next action. You do it and it jumps back up to 11. You're like, okay, that wasn't a good action. What's the next best action? And you keep doing this over and over again to drive performance. But the key is you have to measure the right results. So this is the IR framework. We talked about the 4-point checklist when it comes to evaluating your initiatives. We talked about ICE when you want to determine whether you're pursuing the right actions. And then we got into key results so you can measure your progress of your business. You can totally do this in your company. And if you do, you'll solve your biggest constraint, your strategic problem, and you'll continue to move forward. Be sure to check out my other videos where I talk more about strategy and I go more in depth on this very topic. Cheers.